Emily stared at the ceiling, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound filling the bedroom. The bed beside her was empty, as it often was. Mark had left early, barely muttering a goodbye before heading to the office. Even when he was home, he wasn't really present. Their conversations had dwindled down to reminders about bills, work schedules, and grocery lists. The warmth, the laughter, the intimacy. They had all faded into the routine of a marriage that now felt more like a business arrangement. She turned over, grabbing her phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media. Pictures of smiling couples on vacations, anniversary posts filled with declarations of love. It all felt like a cruel reminder of what she used to have. There had been a time when Mark would pull her into his arms after a long day, kiss her just because he wanted to, or surprise her with little things that made her feel cherished. But now, it was as if they were strangers living under the same roof. Emily sighed and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She padded into the kitchen, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat at the dining table, staring at the steam curling from the cup. She could feel it. Something inside her was breaking. She needed more. She needed to feel wanted, desired, seen. Her phone buzzed. An email from a client requesting urgent changes to a project. With a sigh, she walked over to her laptop and opened it, ready to get lost in work. But as soon as she tried to log in, the page refused to load. The little Wi-Fi icon at the top of her screen flashed an error. Great. Just another thing to add to the list of frustrations. She clicked through different settings, restarted the router, and even turned the laptop off and on again. Nothing. Mark usually handled these kinds of issues, but he was too busy to care about things like this anymore. Annoyed, Emily picked up her phone and searched for the service provider's customer support. A few rings later, a polite voice answered. "We can send a technician first thing in the morning," the representative assured her. "Fine," she muttered, pinching the bridge of her nose. After hanging up, she leaned back in her chair, feeling the quiet weight of the house pressing down on her. Tomorrow, someone would come and fix the internet. But what about everything else? What about the silence that stretched between her and Mark? What about the emptiness she felt when she looked at him and saw nothing of the man she had once fallen in love with? She exhaled deeply and closed her laptop. This was just a minor issue, an inconvenience. Nothing more. But in the back of her mind, she had no idea that this simple call for help would soon ignite something far more dangerous than a broken connection. The doorbell rang sharply, breaking the quiet that had settled over the house. Emily checked the time, right on schedule. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her blouse and made her way to the door, preparing for nothing more than a routine service call. As she pulled it open, she was met with a warm, confident smile. Alex stood before her, tool bag in hand, his easy demeanor immediately setting him apart from the usual technicians she had dealt with before. He was younger than she expected, with dark eyes that carried an effortless charm. "Morning," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Internet troubles?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Yeah, it's been acting up for a few days now. Keeps cutting out when I need it most." Alex chuckled as he set his bag down. "Sounds like a classic case of bad timing. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." He moved through the room with familiarity, assessing the router and checking the connections, while Emily hovered nearby, arms crossed. She wasn't sure why, but there was something about his presence that made her hyper-aware of herself. "So, what do you do?" Alex asked, glancing over at her as he unplugged a few wires. "Web design," she replied, watching his hands work. "I work from home, so when the internet goes out, it pretty much ruins my day." "That explains the frustration." He smirked. "I get it. People don't usually call me in a good mood." Emily let out a small laugh, the first real one she had in days. "Well, you don't seem too bothered by it." "I've been called worse than an inconvenience," he teased, flashing her a playful grin. "Besides, I kind of like solving problems." His easy confidence made her smile, and she found herself watching him a little too closely. The way he moved, the way he spoke. It was effortless, like someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it. She shook the thought away, reminding herself why he was here. So, what's the verdict? Do I need a new router, or is this fixable? Alex leaned over her laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard as he ran a few tests. Looks like a software issue, he murmured, his voice lower now that they were closer. Emily turned her head slightly, and for a brief moment, their faces were just inches apart. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, subtle but noticeable. Her breath hitched slightly, and she caught herself staring. Alex must have noticed because his fingers stilled for a moment before he cleared his throat and sat back. "Shouldn't take too long," he said, his tone lighter, though there was something unreadable in his expression. Emily felt her pulse quicken, unsure if she was imagining the shift between them. A lingering gaze, a fleeting moment of stillness, a feeling that something had just changed, whether she wanted it to or not. Emily leaned against the counter, watching as Alex finished his final adjustments. The internet was back up, and the job was done. Yet neither of them seemed in a hurry for him to leave. The air between them carried a charge that neither acknowledged out loud, but both undeniably felt. She exhaled softly, arms crossed, more to keep herself steady than anything else. "I should probably thank you properly," she said, her voice lighter than she intended, an unspoken invitation laced between her words. Alex turned to face her, his smirk lingering, but his eyes searching hers for something deeper. "No thanks necessary," he murmured, stepping just close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. She knew this was dangerous. She knew this was wrong. But the hunger for something, anything that made her feel alive again, drowned out every voice of reason screaming at her to stop. Before she could rethink it, before logic could take over, she closed the space between them. Her lips met his in a soft, hesitant kiss, a brush of warmth and uncertainty. She expected Alex to pull away, to remind her of the line she was crossing. Instead, his hands found her waist, grounding her as he responded, deepening the kiss with a quiet urgency. It was electric, intoxicating, everything she had been craving but had convinced herself she could live without. Her fingers curled against his shirt, pulling him closer, chasing the sensation of feeling wanted, of feeling something real. And then, just as quickly as it started, reality crashed back in. Emily pulled away abruptly, her breath uneven, her heart hammering. She took a step back, her mind scrambling to catch up with what had just happened. She started, but she didn't even know how to finish the thought. Alex ran a hand through his hair, exhaling with a low chuckle. "That was unexpected," he admitted, though the way he looked at her told her he wasn't regretting it. Guilt hit her in waves, but it was drowned out by the rush of desire still lingering between them. She had done the one thing she swore she never would, but she didn't feel regret. She felt alive. Alex's eyes searched hers, waiting for her to be the one to set the boundary. She should tell him to forget it, to walk out and never speak of this again. But instead, she met his gaze, knowing exactly what she was about to do. "Maybe it shouldn't be unexpected," she said softly, the words more dangerous than the kiss itself. Alex's smirk returned, slow and knowing. "Then maybe we should talk about that. Somewhere else." Emily didn't hesitate this time. She nodded. The choice had been made. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she sent the text. "Leaving now. See you soon." Her pulse quickened as the message was marked as read, followed almost immediately by Alex's response. "Can't wait." A simple response, yet it sent shivers through her, a thrill coursing through her veins. Lying had become easier than she expected. "I'm meeting Claire for lunch," she had told Mark that morning, brushing a kiss against his cheek as he sat at the kitchen counter, too distracted by his work emails to question her. He barely looked up, just nodding absently. If he had truly seen her, really looked at her, maybe he would have noticed how different she had become. Her once mundane days were now filled with hidden excitement, stolen glances, and breathless anticipation. The first time she went to Alex's apartment, she had hesitated at his door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it from inside. When he opened it, a teasing smirk on his lips, the tension between them had snapped, pulling them into each other as if they had been waiting for that exact moment their whole lives. From that day on, it became a ritual, sneaking away whenever she could, telling Mark she had errands, coffee dates, or work meetings. The thrill of getting away with it was almost as intoxicating as the way Alex made her feel. Every touch, every whispered word against her skin, was a stark contrast to the cold distance in her marriage. The more they met, the less guilt she felt. Was it really cheating if she had been emotionally abandoned for so long? That's how she justified it, convincing herself that Mark had checked out of their marriage long before she did. But as their meetings grew more frequent, so did the danger. Mark had begun noticing small things. "You've been out a lot lately," he remarked one evening as she stepped through the door, her hair slightly tousled, the faintest trace of Alex's cologne still clinging to her. "More than usual." She laughed, brushing it off effortlessly. "Just trying to keep busy. You know how boring things get when you're always at work." He didn't press further, but she could feel his eyes lingering on her longer than usual. It was subtle, but it was a shift. She knew she needed to be more careful, but the rush was addictive. Every secret meeting, every time she slipped into Alex's bed, every moment she spent wrapped in something that felt real, kept her coming back for more. But the closer she got to him, the more reckless she became. And she had no idea that Mark was already starting to put the pieces together. Mark sat at the dining table, absently stirring his coffee as he watched Emily from across the room. She was distracted, her eyes darting to her phone more than usual, her fingers moving quickly over the screen before flipping it face down on the counter. It was subtle, but he noticed. He noticed everything. At first, he had dismissed his unease as paranoia. Emily had always been independent, often making plans with friends, running errands, or working late on her design projects. But lately, something was different. She had started dressing differently, subtly but noticeably. Perfume she never used around him, clothes that were just a little more fitted than before. She laughed more, but not at home. With him, she was distant, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. And then there were the lies. She thought he didn't notice how often she left without giving a full answer, how vague she had become about where she was going. The first few times he had brushed it off. But then it became a pattern. The way she clutched her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she took longer to answer simple questions as if crafting the perfect response in her head. One night, as she was in the shower, he saw her phone buzz from the nightstand. He glanced at it, just for a second. "Alex. Can't wait to see you." Mark's stomach clenched. He had never seen that name before. Not in any of the friends she casually mentioned. Not in the conversations they had over dinner. What little they had left. He reached for the phone, but just as his fingers brushed the screen, Emily's voice called from the bathroom. "Can you grab me a towel?" Mark pulled back instantly, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed a towel from the closet and handed it to her, forcing a smile as she peeked out. She had no idea what he had just seen. The next morning, he made a decision. He wouldn't ask her. He wouldn't accuse her. He would follow her. That evening, Emily kissed his cheek, barely, and told him she was meeting Claire for dinner. He smiled, nodding like he believed her. 5 minutes after she left, he grabbed his keys and followed. She didn't go to the restaurant. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched her car weave through the city, taking a route that led nowhere near the usual places she went. His pulse pounded harder with each turn. 15 minutes later, she pulled into a quiet apartment complex. Mark parked a short distance away, his hands clammy as he watched her step out of the car, smoothing down her dress. She checked her phone, typed something quickly, then walked toward one particular door with a familiarity that made Mark's blood run cold. The door opened before she even knocked, A man stood there leaning against the frame with an easy smile. Emily stepped inside, and the door shut behind her. Emily barely had time to catch her breath as she stepped into Alex's apartment, the door clicking shut behind her. She turned, expecting to see his usual smirk, the playful glint in his eyes that always made her forget the weight of her choices. But before either of them could speak, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the air like a blade. "Emily." Her stomach dropped. She spun around, her entire body freezing at the sight of Mark standing just outside the still unlocked door. His face was unreadable, but his clenched jaw and the way his hands curled into fists at his sides told her everything she needed to know. Alex tensed immediately, stepping slightly in front of Emily. "Mark, listen." "Don't," Mark snapped, his eyes locked onto Emily's. "I want to hear it from her." Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might shatter through her ribs. 1,000 explanations fought to the surface, but none of them mattered. There was no denying it, no talking her way out of this. He had followed her. He had seen everything. She started, but nothing came out. Mark took a slow step forward, his breath ragged. "How long?" Emily swallowed, her hands shaking. "Mark, how long?" His voice was dangerously low now, his eyes dark with something she had never seen before. Alex shifted beside her. "Mark, you should calm down." "You don't get to talk." Mark's voice exploded, his hand slamming against the doorframe. Alex straightened, his posture shifting from cautious to defensive. Emily stepped between them, her voice shaking. "Stop! Just stop!" Silence filled the small apartment, thick and suffocating. Emily's mind raced, trying to find the right words, but the truth sat heavy on her tongue. What could she possibly say? That she had been lonely? That she had felt invisible in her own marriage? That Alex had reminded her what it felt like to be wanted? None of that mattered now. Mark exhaled harshly, shaking his head as if trying to process everything. "I knew something was wrong," he murmured, almost to himself. "But I never thought, not like this." Guilt clawed at Emily's chest, but deep down, another emotion stirred. Fear. Not of Mark hurting her, but of what came next. The end of everything she had built, the life she had been trying to escape from but never thought would truly crumble. Mark looked at her then, eyes filled with hurt. "Do you even regret it?" Tears burned at the edges of her vision. "I don't." He held up a hand. "Just answer me. Him or me." The ultimatum she had been dreading hung in the air like a final sentence. Her past and future stood before her, waiting for an answer. And for the first time, she truly didn't know what she would choose. Mark's question lingered in the air, heavy with finality. Him or me? Emily felt the weight of his gaze burning into her, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she had. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else in the room. Alex stood beside her, tense but silent. He wasn't begging her to choose him. He wasn't making promises. He simply waited, letting her decide. Mark, on the other hand, was unraveling in front of her. His anger had given way to something worse. Hurt, betrayal, the realization that his wife had been slipping away for far longer than he had noticed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. How could she answer when she didn't even know what she truly wanted? This affair had never really been about Alex. It had been about escape, about feeling something again, about proving to herself that she wasn't invisible, that she was still desirable, still alive. She turned to Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Mark let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "That says enough." Guilt crushed her chest as she reached out instinctively, but he pulled back. "You had a choice before I found out, Emily. You made it the second you walked through his door." Tears welled in her eyes. "It wasn't that simple." Mark's jaw tightened. "It was. And maybe if you had told me how you felt, maybe if we had tried instead of you running to him, things could have been different." Alex exhaled through his nose, finally speaking. Mark turned on him sharply. You don't get to play the good guy now. You knew she was married. Alex didn't flinch, but he didn't argue either. Emily wiped at her tears, her voice shaking. I wasn't happy, Mark. I haven't been for a long time. And you think I was? His voice cracked, raw emotion spilling out. You think I didn't feel it? The way you drifted away? The way we barely even spoke anymore? But I didn't go looking for someone else, Emily. I stayed. I waited. And I thought maybe... He broke off, rubbing a hand over his face. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. Mark exhaled sharply, his decision seemingly made for him. I deserve better than this, he muttered. Better than someone who wasn't even going to tell me the truth until she had no choice. Emily's heart clenched as she realized that even if she begged him to stay, even if she swore she would end things with Alex, Mark had already started walking away. Physically and emotionally. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had already chosen, long before tonight. As the door slammed behind him, leaving her alone with Alex, she realized one thing with bone-deep certainty. No matter where she went from here, nothing in her life would ever be the same again.